Hi, welcome back, listeners. This is Ravi from Fraud Technology Podcast. And today we have the privilege of hosting Mr. Anthony Gitton, a seasoned investigator with almost 15 years' experience in the fraud domain. He's been especially focused on the insurance sector, so most of the today's podcast will be focused on fraud in the insurance sector itself. Join us in listening to his expertise and insights on the fraud best practices in the insurance sector, especially. Um, Welcome to the podcast, Anthony. It is so nice to have you here.
Well, I'd like to thank you for having me here.
So nice to finally have a conversation with you. I did go through your profile, as I just mentioned to the listeners as well. A lot of years of experience in the insurance domain, and especially fraud. Is there anything specific that appeals to you when it comes to fraud or the insurance sector itself?
Well, it's funny. So I've actually found myself in the insurance sector almost by chance and happenstance. I
Mm,
just gotten out of college
mm,
and I was thinking, what was my next step? Am I going to go into law school? Um, what's my next step in my career and my life path? And so I was working in an insurance company in order to, kind of make ends meet and
mm,
working, in their claims department. And at one point,
mm,
we had required anti-fraud training. There's a lot of states in the United States that requires that certain insurance company employees be given anti-fraud training in order to potentially detect fraud, because
mm,
sooner or later
mm,
that's going to come across your desk.
mm,
And so I was watching this presentation from, the fraud investigators from the company I was working for. I was utterly fascinated.
mm,
I had no idea.
mm,
I knew that there was insurance fraud, of course. I knew that
mm,
insurance fraud was a big problem. I mean, I'm
mm,
from Miami, Florida, so that we know there's an issue there.
mm,
But I had no idea that insurance companies employed their own investigators to
mm,
actually protect themselves and the public from fraud. And
mm,
I was utterly fascinated with what they did on a
mm,
day-to-day basis. And I said to myself,
mm,
this is where I want to be.
mm,
This is what I want to do with my life. And that, for me, that anti-fraud class completely changed my career path, my life. And so I started to work towards becoming a part of that fraud investigations unit in that insurance company. And I was very lucky that, they took me, who's pretty much
mm,
green,
mm.
with
Yep.
no fraud experience whatsoever, and
Mm,
built me up little by little. So
mm, mm,
um, yeah, I find the insurance fraud industry to be completely,
mm,
compelling. Every day is different.
mm. Yep.
You come into the office thinking, all right, I'm going to be doing A, B, C, and D. This is how my day is going to go, and it completely goes completely different. It is, every, you're at the seat of your pants all the time.
Yep.
So it's a fantastic job.
Mm. Wonderful, wonderful. So you talked about the training as a employee in the insurance company. I know compliance teams or anti-money laundering, especially by law, requires that everyone in the company is trained on money laundering itself. So is that a mandate that all people in the company are also trained fraud, or is it like a specific set of team members that are trained on fraud?
It depends on the state because insurance is a state power. The
Mm,
states actually run it. There are some federal statutes built around insurance fraud, but it's mostly handled by the states on a day-to-day basis, especially compliance in regards to insurance companies. So each state has different ideas as to how you're supposed to comply with state statutory regulations.
mm,
But most states have a mandate that certain insurance company employees be provided anti-fraud training. That would be for the most part, would be customer service agents, claims
mm,
adjusters, obviously the fraud investigators themselves,
mm,
and the legal department.
mm,
Some other ones add producers and underwriters as well.
mm,
So those are the groups within the company that are
mm.
mandated to have annual training, and in some cases also new hire training.
Okay, okay, understood, understood. I wanted to understand how a insurance fraud investigator or fraud analyst differs from a general financial institution in a bank or a fintech. What is the main difference that you see between insurance fraud analysts or fraud investigators between others?
So the big major difference between insurance fraud investigators and any insurance fraud professional and other fintech investigators is that insurance companies have a contract,
mm,
sometimes with the very person they're actually might be conducting an investigation on. We investigate numbers of different entities. There's people who are on the on the third party side, which is claimants, for instance, who are not insured under the policy.
mm,
It could you have individuals that we might be investigating like attorneys or medical providers or some other type of entity that's involved in the claim.
mm,
But we do investigate on occasion our own insureds who might be involved in the fraud. And we
mm,
have certain contractual obligations
mm,
with our insureds.
mm, mm,
So I think that's a big difference. When you're handling any type of investigation, you
mm,
have to investigate it properly. And when you're actually investigating your own insured, you want to make sure that you're still treating your insured as your customer.
yep.
Because as we all know, sometimes red flags might pop up that make you question if a fraud is taking place,
Mm,
but it might not once
mm,
you start to actually investigate the process.
mm,
So I think that contractual linkage
mm,
between potentially one of the people you're investigating and
mm,
your company, I think changes dramatically a lot
mm, mm, mm. Okay.
how you handle an investigation. That's why it's different.
Okay, understood, understood. And when I was asking even the question, I realized another question that I was having, which is basically, what's the difference between a fraud analyst and a fraud investigator? It sounds like investigator or special investigative unit and fraud analyst itself seems like different roles, and SIU seems a lot more serious unit. And I wanted to understand what are the real technical differences. It feels there is a difference, but I would love to know what is the actual difference.
So for the most part, there's numbers of different roles depending on what kind of special investigations unit is part of the insurance company, right? But the
Mm,
two main roles outside of management is the special investigators and then the analysts.
mm,
An investigator technically handles, think about it as the difference between tactical and strategic.
okay.
So an investigator will handle the day-to-day investigation of
Mm,
insurance fraud.
mm,
They'll be handed a case
mm,
of a certain fraud allegation, and they will then investigate it to the best of their ability to
mm,
determine if fraud is or is not taking place.
mm,
A fraud analyst is a little different. Some
mm,
fraud analysts are predict like look for fraud from the get-go. So, for
mm,
instance, they use technology to proactively detect insurance fraud.
mm,
So instead of relying on a human being, a claims adjuster, an underwriter in detecting the fraud, they use technology to perhaps determine this is a potentially questionable claim that has
mm,
just been filed.
mm,
They will review it and give it to it for an investigator for investigation. Other types of analytical work is more reactive.
mm,
So if an investigator, during their investigation into that one singular claim,
mm,
starts to detect potential ring activity, they
mm,
believe that there is a criminal organization
mm,
orchestrating this fraud and it
mm,
might be involved in other frauds that's hit us or other companies. A
mm,
fraud analyst will also be brought in to start to look and decipher the data and
mm,
say, okay, there is a fraud ring
mm,
working in this claim.
mm,
They've hit us in other claims. This
mm,
is what we need to do A, B, C, and D.
mm, mm, mm.
There
Okay.
is one other type of investigator that's a little different.
Mm.
They're the major case investigators.
Yeah, that's
And
also something that I saw. Yeah, in your profile. Yeah, go ahead, please.
one, yeah, once you get to a major case investigator, they
Mm,
work more hand in hand with the fraud analyst. So once a
mm,
fraud analyst starts to
mm,
detect or
mm,
really show that there's a fraud ring that has been hitting
mm,
your particular company,
mm,
they'll hand that over to a major case investigator and
mm,
start to look at all the prior
mm,
claims, all the current claims, and investigate that larger chunk of fraud.
mm.
So those are the main differences between the roles.
Okay, okay. And if I understood, so I also come from predominantly from the financial institution side. So I'm new to the insurance side. So fraud analysts in financial institutions, especially, right? As you rightly said, they use technology or a fraud platform to review all the transactions, all the customers being onboarded, and they have certain flags that are generated or alerts that are generated. They are responsible to clear out the false positives, and if they suspect there is a higher chance of fraud, then they hand over to a more serious team like investigation unit. Is that the same process that also happens in insurance as well?
That would be that would be the proactive process that I talked about, where they use technology to detect fraud while it's occurring. But once there is that reactive,
Mm,
when they start to suspect a fraud ring and they start to go
mm.
back to the old data and piece it all together as
Okay,
well.
okay. Understand, understand. And I also see that if some certifications, like for example, fraud claim law specialist certification, right? Congratulations on that. I think you got it like a couple of months ago, right?
Correct.
So
Yeah.
congratulations on that. I also see that you have another certification called Certified Insurance Fraud Analyst certificate as well. So I see
Yep.
multiple certifications available for fraud. I have not seen that many for financial institutions, but seems like insurance does have a lot of certifications. So can I
Yeah,
understand?
and there's actually more.
Oh, okay. So can I understand a little bit more about what these certifications are about and how it really helps in your day-to-day life, and what are the different types of certifications that you talked about?
So the Certified Insurance Fraud Analyst is a fantastic certification that's provided by the International Association of
Mm,
Special Investigative Units. It's the association for insurance fraud professionals internationally.
mm,
Its biggest presence is, of course, in the United States, but they do have members all across the world.
mm,
And the Certified Insurance Fraud Analyst, it's more of a test that's given once you have enough experience as an insurance fraud analyst.
mm,
They test you on a number of different things. They want to make sure that you're an expert in the fraud identification tools that exist. That
mm,
you're able to do, for instance, um, being able to analyze whether an insurance fraud ring is actually taking place. So it's about, I don't know, if I remember correctly, it was like about a 4 hour exam. They
mm,
give you a packet of documents this big.
mm.
I don't know how many different spreadsheets, and they say, "Here
Mm.
you go, answer the questions. Good luck."
Oh wow.
But it's a tough test. It's a fantastic test. The same organization also has another test, which is Certified Insurance Fraud Investigator,
Mm,
which more looks at, more tests the knowledge of the investigators who are actually handling the day-to-day fraud.
mm,
But both are fantastic certifications. There's a third called Certified Insurance Fraud Representative,
mm,
which is for those who are kind of building themselves up to being a fraud specialist in
mm,
insurance. Um, it's geared, for example, claims adjusters who really want to get more knowledge
mm,
on insurance fraud. Great certifications. The
mm,
fraud claims law specialist that you talked about, it's a great certification that it kind of is the bridge between fraud investigations and the insurance world.
mm,
So it really builds your knowledge on both, yeah, the fraud investigation side, but what about insurance law and
mm,
contract law?
mm,
So it's a great bridge because, again, yeah, you may be a fraud investigator and a fraud expert in your field, but you
mm,
always have to keep cognizant that the insurance contract is incredibly important, and you
mm,
have to abide by that contract between yourself and your customer.
mm.
The one certification we haven't talked about besides that would be the Certified Fraud Examiner, which I also have, but
Yep.
that's more of a general
Mm,
um, certification for financial fraud
mm,
altogether. I mean, they test you on insurance fraud, bank fraud, credit card fraud, money laundering, everything you can possibly imagine.
mm.
So that's more like a generalist type of certification.
Okay, got it, got it. So you also quickly touched upon contractual fraud, contractor fraud. I believe you also had have done a webinar on the same or a
I
podcast on the
have.
same itself, right? So I wanted to understand what exactly is contractor fraud, and is it specific to insurance itself?
Um, no, it's not specific to insurance itself because any time that you hire a contractor,
Mm,
that contract can obviously come in and take advantage of you.
okay.
What's an easy way of taking advantage of a consumer?
Mm,
They go sight unseen. They go up to your roof.
mm,
Maybe you suspect that you have roof damage. Maybe they knock on your door because there's been a recent storm. That happens a lot. And they say, well, you might have roof damage. Let me give you a free inspection.
mm,
They'll go up there and sometimes they'll cause the damage themselves because they want to get paid
mm.
to put a new roof.
Oh wow. Mm,
Um, so Does that usually more often happen when you have insurance? Of course, because they want to make sure they can get paid.
Mm,
But I mean, contractor fraud can happen with or without the insurance policy or an insurance company involved. It's just going
mm,
to happen more often when that's the case.
mm,
Um, but there's a lot of different ways contractor fraud can actually occur. You know, it could be a water damage claim, and they can be mitigating your house, but not really. They can just take and pocket your money and not do the repairs. They can
mm,
cause the damage themselves.
mm,
But there's a lot of different ways that contractor fraud can victimize
mm.
someone.
Okay, okay. And so it's basically a third party kind of a fraud because the insurer or the claimant is different person, and you as the payee are the insurer, right? And the third party. Okay, okay, got it.
It's potentially only third party. You know, there are instances in when you're handling a questionable contractor fraud case where the insured is knowingly
Also, okay. Mm.
knows it's happening and is
Uh,
okay with it. But
uh,
for the most part, yes, the insured is completely innocent, doesn't know what's going on, is being
yep.
taken advantage of, just like the insurance company.
Okay, okay, got it. I also wanted to understand a little bit about because I've seen the FTC report from last year, and majority of the fraud that I've seen there is related to identity. That somebody steals somebody else's identity and then tries to take over an account takeover of a particular individual, and then uh, cleans the account itself, right? So, what
Yep.
types of fraud is most common in insurance, and what are the typical typologies that you have observed?
Well, you know, I'll start off with talking a little bit on account takeover. It's not as common
Mm,
in our neck of the woods.
mm,
There are some insurance products where that can happen, and that does happen.
mm,
You know, in my old life, in an old company I worked for, you know, they used to handle, you know, mobile phone insurance, and
mm,
account takeover fraud was
mm,
something that would actually happen there.
mm,
For most other types of policies and other types of losses, that's not really a thing, but it does
mm,
happen there.
mm,
The most common types of fraud that you'll see in the insurance space. Um, so let's focus on insured-driven types of fraud.
mm,
You know, it's your own customer.
mm,
Probably the most common types of fraud that you'll probably see is false, fabricated, mysterious disappearance or theft claims.
mm,
Very simple. You go, you claim that certain items were stolen out of your house,
mm,
and you file an insurance claim. Now,
mm.
it could either be the case where the theft is actually legitimate, it happened,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
and they are adding things
Mm.
that weren't
Okay.
in their house in order to take advantage of the situation, or making their things more expensive. Like instead of a 40-inch TV, you have a 75-inch TV. That's
Okay.
probably one of the most common types of fraud.
Mm,
Um, it's a very easy one to actually do. Another one that's pretty common in the insured space is fires. You
mm,
know,
mm,
setting the home that they're living in on fire in order
mm,
to collect on the insurance proceeds.
mm.
Usually you see that when someone's going through some severe financial difficulties, and this
Yep.
is their way out.
Mm, mm,
The more common type of fraud that you'll also see is not from the insured space, for instance, but it's from those third parties. You know, I talked about
contractor.
contractors.
Yep.
Contractor fraud is becoming a serious issue in certain states, especially, for instance, in Florida.
Mm,
Um, you know, one of the worst types of fraud I've seen in the last, you know, year or so are coming from tree companies, for instance. They're
mm,
chasing storms.
mm.
You have trees all, you know, all down across around your property. Some are on your home.
Yep.
You want that tree out,
Yep. Mm,
and they take advantage of that.
mm,
And so what they do is they'll overcharge for the tree, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars over what's reasonable and customary. They'll
mm,
use unnecessary equipment,
mm,
um, and then they will start to use, you know, fear tactics to try and push the insured to overpay for that loss. And they
mm,
will try and push to the insurance company these exorbitant fees. And if we don't pay, they'll put a lien on the
mm,
insured house, which
mm.
is pretty bad.
Okay. Mm,
Other types of common frauds, medical provider fraud.
mm, mm,
You know, you're in an accident case, or no, sorry, you're in an accident claim.
mm,
The other car that you got hit, maybe it hit you as part of a staged accident. Maybe
mm.
it didn't.
Yep.
but they will go to an attorney who will then funnel them to a medical provider who will have them do unnecessary medical procedures,
mm,
overcharge for certain medical
mm,
procedures.
mm.
And so they take advantage of the public, and sometimes they actually harm the public by making them go through those unnecessary medical procedures,
Yeah.
surgeries they didn't need to have to do.
Mm, mm, mm,
I've seen some $1 million cases
mm,
um, where we're looking at what they're charging for epidurals,
mm, mm,
and they're incredibly overcharged, or
mm,
they went through unnecessary surgery. So that's what the scam's all about. It's about getting money, and to heck with
mm, mm.
the
The
general
insurer.
health of that poor person.
Yep, yep, yep. Okay, got it, got it. So I now realize from your answer that we tend to club insurance into one bucket, but there's just like so many types of insurance. Because when you're talking about it, is when I realize that there is actually quite a bit of types of insurance, and there may be very different ways of doing fraud itself in each of them, right? I wanted to understand because in the financial services, right, one you have the large banks which do traditional products, high ticket, low volume kind of products where the profitability is high for the bank. Whereas you see fintechs which are focused on, let's say, doing a $300 remittance to from one country to another. And I also see that in insurance as well. I don't know whether it would be called micro insurance or even like a medium size insurance. Like for example, I'm renting a car for like 10 days and I get some amount of that is insurance, right? So it may or may not be worth even investigating because the investigator's time may not be worth investigating that case, right? And so I wanted to understand in such cases of where very high volumes but very small claims, how do you deal with that? I want to understand, have you dealt with that kind of things? If not, then we can probably move on to the other things. But how do you deal with high volume, low claim kind of scenarios?
So, I mean, it depends on the company. Everyone has a different way of doing their own thing. Sometimes where you see high volume, low dollar claims is when I told you talked about that mobile phone insurance. You
Mm,
know,
mm, mm,
phones can be expensive, but we're
mm.
talking about what, $500 more or
Yep.
less, maybe a little
Mm,
more.
yeah.
It it costs money to investigate that,
Yep.
especially with the
Definitely.
large amount of fraud on a day-to-day basis.
Mm,
Another one from another type of line of insurance would be, glass fraud. You have someone
mm,
who may be filing the same glass claim over and over and over again, or you might have a glass company or a body shop who's involved in that fraud. It's hard to investigate that on a day-to-day basis. You
mm,
know, an insurance company has to determine,
mm,
what they need to do in order to stop fraud. You know, our company has an attitude that regardless of the amount of fraud that's involved,
mm,
we will investigate it.
mm,
Because what
mm,
happens is that if you let that one
mm,
potential one small one go, it's
mm,
going to start to build up. Because some individuals who are starting out in insurance fraud, they'll start off with a low dollar value claim
yeah.
as a
Mm,
trial balloon. As a trial balloon.
mm,
Oh, it worked.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
let's try a little higher. Oh, it worked. Well, let's try a little higher. And so eventually it's going to become a problem. And then,
Yeah.
in regards to, organizations like those body shops, or the fraud rings that might operate in certain other jurisdictions where they do small fraud and keep hitting you little by little, what you're going to do is you're eventually going to bleed out. You're going to bleed out through
Mm,
small pinpricks, but
mm,
eventually it's going to hurt your company. So that's when, if you start to detect
mm,
large amounts of small dollar value fraud, that can
mm,
still become a major case.
mm,
You can have your fraud analyst say, okay, well, we've had 30 claims at $500 or something.
mm,
Let's give that to a major case investigator because now we have a multi-claim
mm,
fraud situation.
mm, 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 mm. Okay. So what would be a condition for something to become a major case unit? I mean, the case that goes to major case unit, right? What would be the
It, it,
condition?
it could be a number.
Mm,
It could be a number of things. It could be one singular, extremely expensive
mm,
claim where there's fraud attached.
mm,
Um, Usually, what we actually start to look for is
mm,
how is this entity that we're looking at?
mm,
Are they involved in multi-claim fraud?
mm,
And we look at it as, are they involved in multi-claim fraud with the entire insurance industry?
mm,
And are they having multi-claim fraud specifically with our company? If you
mm.
have yeses to those questions, that's something that needs to probably be taken a look at by major case.
Okay.
Um,
Mm. Okay. So when you say is the claim multi-claim insurance against multiple companies in the industry, how do you know that? I mean, is there a way for you to know that the same claim has been filed by different in the different insurers case? So there's like a kind of a
yeah,
data sharing format already.
yeah. There's a consortium where this data is actually shared throughout the insurance industry. Yes.
Okay, okay, okay. Of the person that is doing it, and also the amount that they are doing it, and then you kind of collate, and then you can see if I.
Yeah, there's very basic information, amount, claim
Mm,
number, company,
mm,
individual involved, perhaps also medical provider and attorney providers. And then, if you want more information, you have to call that other company. And there's
mm,
a legal process involved with getting the information, but you can at least tell, okay, this person has been involved in
mm, mm,
X number of claims.
Okay, got it, got it, got it. So I also want to understand, right? So in the insurance space, typically the insured is actually paying the money over time, and then at some point
Premium.
of time, there's a big chunk of money that they're going to claim, right? So which is slightly different from, let's say, in the financial services where the customer themselves are putting the money up front. And so if there's a problem or a fraud that happens and the money is taken out there, then the customer would feel outraged, basically. Whereas in the case of insurance, he's paying the money and he's going to claim at a later stage, and which is a very different uh, methodology, right? So I wanted to understand how do you handle customer experience? I know you talked about a little bit about customer experience when a fraud is happening and how you need to deal in terms of communication. So I wanted to understand, is there any different way that you do in an insurance scenario um, when you're handling the customer itself?
So I think that there's a lot of similarities because,
Mm.
on your side, well, not on your side, on the other financial services side, when
Yeah.
someone gets defrauded,
Mm.
it's money that's taken out directly out of their account. That's going to really upset someone, and they
Yep.
want their money back ASAP, and they
Correct.
probably want that person's head.
Yep.
Um, same, there's a similar onus when it's coming on the insurance side because think about it like this: you have someone who's filing an insurance claim. They
Mm.
probably just had a really god awful day.
Mm.
Whether it's their house, they lost their house or their possessions, or they got into a car accident, or they're in some type of injury,
Mm.
they need that help. They need
Mm.
that money as soon as possible. And
Mm.
your job while working for an insurance company is to make that person whole,
Mm. Mm.
to
Mm.
try and make up
Yep.
to that person for that really bad day, because that's why they're paying premium to you.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
the
Mm.
moment that you start to hold off
Mm.
any type of payment because there's some type of insurance fraud going on, that's probably going to upset that person,
Mm. Mm.
especially if they're the ones that are being looked at.
Mm. Mm.
So there's a that's why it's so important for insurance companies to never forget that whether they're investigating an insurance fraud or not, they still owe
Mm.
that customer
Mm.
exemplary customer service and
Yep.
respect.
Mm.
And so what you want to do is you want to make that process, as quick and as seamless as possible. If you detect that there's red flags, you want that investigation to start immediately. You want
Mm.
the investigator to jump on that investigation ASAP. You want that customer to be talked to by the claims adjuster at all times, by the investigator if they need to talk to them, and tell them and explain to them what the process is
Mm. Mm.
and where they're at and how much longer it may take.
Mm.
At the same time, we don't want to keep that claim
Mm.
open indefinitely. First of all,
Mm.
we can't do that. That's bad faith. We're breaking the contract.
Yep.
So there's a lot of pressures
Mm.
on insurance companies and on fraud specialists in
Mm.
insurance companies
Mm.
on customer service and how they handle insurance fraud cases.
Okay, I understand.
Um,
Mm. Mm. Yeah. So I also wanted to understand because most of the fraud that the type of fraud that you talked about was around claim itself, which is for one customer may or may not happen because It's happening in a less number of cases. That's the reason why the whole insurance industry even works, right? So for an individual
Right.
customer, I mean, hopefully it doesn't never happen, right? A claim never happens, which is good for both of us, right? So I wanted to understand, most of the frauds that you talked about was around the claim itself. Are there any types of other frauds that happen, which has nothing to do with the claim itself?
Yeah. There's a couple. One, there is once the check is sent out to the insured, sometimes some people actually
Steal the
are
check.
able to steal the
Mm,
check,
mm,
sign it, and pocket it, and our insured is left hurting.
mm,
Other times, it's not even that they somehow grab the check, maybe as it was going through the mail system or some other way. Sometimes that
mm,
third party that's representing the insured pockets the
mm,
money and runs. Remember, I told you the contractor
mm,
takes the
mm.
money, never repairs.
Yep.
We've seen public adjusters who forge signatures of our insured's name and take the money. That's
Mm,
another type of fraud that can happen. It's after the payment is rendered or
mm,
once the payment is rendered. The
mm,
other type of fraud besides claims in the check is prior to
mm,
the claim itself.
mm,
It's on the underwriting side once the policy is taken out and the
mm,
application is first filed.
mm,
There are times where your customer might not be honest with you when they're filling out that application.
mm,
And
mm,
so there are certain questions that insurance applications might have, depending on the company, depending on the type of policy.
mm,
And it's used by the company to determine two things. Number one, are you insurable?
mm, mm,
Number two, if you are insurable, how much premium are we going to charge? Are you a greater or lesser risk?
mm,
Depending on how you answer those questions, that's determined.
mm,
Sometimes you'll have customers who
mm,
will not be honest in order to get, pay lower premium,
mm,
or in cases get insurance when they shouldn't get insurance from you.
mm.
So
Okay.
that's another facet of fraud that you have on the insurance side.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Got it. I mean, you also talked about you being a certified fraud examiner, right? I'm assuming that gives you the ability to train new people who are interested in fraud, or people in general, you are training people, right? So when you're doing this kind of trainings, what type of people or what kind of personalities do suit towards a fraud analyst or a fraud investigative kind of roles? What kind of people excel at that kind of roles?
Um, People who have a natural curiosity.
Mm,
There's you can train anyone
mm,
on anything,
mm.
but I think you cannot train that natural curiosity. Do
Okay.
you have an individual who wants to dig and find out the actual facts and truth that's going on?
Mm,
It's almost like hunting. You once you get a clue, you want to get to your next clue until you actually get to the final, that
mm,
that final hard truth about what's going on in this claim, and that desire
mm,
is something that you cannot train in anyone. So if you
mm,
have someone who has that natural affinity,
mm,
who's curious, who wants to dig,
mm,
that's a perfect person, I think, for heck
mm,
any type of person
mm,
in insurance fraud investigation or fraud investigations
mm,
holistically.
mm.
Um, Somebody, you have to be detail oriented,
Yep. Mm,
big time.
mm,
You have to have incredible time management skills because you're not going to do one
mm,
investigation at a time. You're
mm,
going to have, 20, 30 investigations assigned to you every month, and you have to be able to actually
mm,
juggle all the competing
mm, mm,
requirements
mm,
on of your time and on your job.
mm.
And
Okay.
again, the detail oriented is super important because you have to be cognizant with investigative procedures, legal requirements, contractual requirements, what's going on in that specific claim. And there's, like you said, so many different types of policies
Mm,
and so many different types of state laws because you're handling
mm,
investigations all across the country that you have
mm,
to be detail oriented to keep that all together.
mm. Okay. Understand. So I also wanted to understand, as part of the investigative team, I know fraud analysts would predominantly rely on technology to generate alerts for them. How do you use technology in the investigative side of things? I know you talked a little bit briefly in your profile about link analysis. I would love to know what kind of technology and how do you leverage technology to do your day-to-day job.
So link analysis is more for the fraud analyst. So that link
Oh,
analysis
okay.
tool allows you to, let me put it this way. If you've seen any police procedural TV show,
Mm,
there's times when they're looking at a criminal organization
mm,
and the police will go into this room and it's going to have this blank wall and they're going to have pictures and
mm,
buildings and they're going to be tied to each other with pieces of string. I don't know why they keep doing that because nobody uses string. People use computer algorithms.
uh-huh,
But it's essentially that. It links
mm,
people, businesses, phone numbers, claims,
mm,
organizations to each other, creating a web
mm,
which will tell you yes or no.
mm.
Is this
Okay.
an insurance fraud ring that you're dealing with? That's
Mm,
more for the analysts.
mm,
We use different types of predictive analytics tools,
mm,
both rules-based and AI-based,
mm,
um,
mm,
connected to tons of different algorithms and pieces of information to do that predictive
mm,
analysis on, is this a potentially questionable claim that just
mm,
got filed?
mm,
Those are the major tools that analysts use
mm,
on a day-to-day basis.
mm,
Investigators um,
mm,
use tools that, for instance, they could look up prior claims,
mm.
through that insurance company exchange.
Yeah.
They can use, forensics tools to check on the
Mm,
pictures that are provided to them on the claim, to actually
mm,
take a closer look at those pictures.
mm,
They can use um, access to social media to look up, well, what's
mm,
this person's social media profile? What are they doing
mm,
that might bring to question their claim? For instance, on an injury claim, you'd be surprised how
mm,
often, when I used to investigate claims,
mm,
somebody said that they had catastrophic injuries, but I
mm,
can actually see them doing cartwheels in social media.
mm. Okay.
Um,
Mm,
and then other tools could be TransUnion or Accurate, where they
mm,
can go and see, what's a person's background. Do
mm,
they have liens, judgments? Do they have bankruptcies? Do they have financial motive to commit this type of fraud? Have they been arrested for fraud in the past or
mm,
some other type of financial crime like money laundering
mm,
or forgery or something? Because if they've done
mm,
it once,
mm. They, yeah.
possibly they're doing it again.
Okay, got it, got it. You talked about the fraud consortium multiple times. What is the fraud consortium called for the insurers? Is it like a company or is it like a regulator mandated thing?
It's run by Verisk. It's a
Uh,
company.
oh, okay.
Um,
Mm,
but but and I'll use the word but, is
mm,
it mandated by regulators?
mm,
Yes.
mm,
I can tell you that there's at least one state that specifically says you
mm,
must use quote unquote insure, what's it called?
mm.
Insure fraud databases. I can't remember what exactly the verbiage in the
Yeah.
statute reads, but they pretty much mean that. It's sort of mandated by the insurance industry
Mm,
and by regulators, but it's also something that you really need to use
mm.
to protect yourselves and your customers.
Okay, got it. So one of the things that I was also being curious, right? For example, whenever I've seen shows, most of the time, detective shows especially, right? The detective or the investigator has had cases where they could not close, and so they are open cases, and they have kept it for years long, right? But I'm assuming that because you have a contract with your insured, which means there's probably an SLA. If you are unsure, you probably need to err on the side of just giving it. I'm not sure. I'm probably making an assumption here. So what I wanted to understand is how far do you go? Is it like a investigator in the police department who's like living with that even after being retired and like the open case like that, right? I'm assuming that how do you? I'm
Yeah.
assuming there is an SLA for a investigator that they have to close this case no matter what, even irrespective of information. So I wanted to understand how far do you go?
That's a fantastic question. Let me start off first with no, we don't keep it open for a lifetime because,
Mm,
again, we have that contract with the insured. We have to
correct.
close that claim. We have to
Mm,
close that claim timely. And certain states have certain statutory regulations on what that amount is. Usually, just to give you an idea, usually most insurance fraud investigations are closed within 30 days.
mm. Oh wow.
Um, some go much more than that, but that's usually on a much more complex investigation.
Mm,
Um, and that's when you start to, get your legal department involved and that kind of situation. But usually, 30 days is when most investigations are actually closed. Because sooner or later, we have to make a determination. Are we going to pay or deny the claim? We cannot leave that open
mm,
forever.
mm, mm, mm.
Um, you know, there are times where you have to make a business decision
Yeah.
and move to pay the claim. Once we have enough proof to deny a claim for fraud, that's done. If we
Mm,
don't, it's going to get paid. If we
mm,
suspect insurance fraud, and that's the
mm,
threshold, we'll inform the state's
mm,
Department of Insurance.
mm, mm.
But yeah, we can't keep it open indefinitely. But
Okay.
some do
Okay.
take months.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Understand. So when you say that you do play the claim, but you do have a suspicion, so you do file a report with the state insurer.
Yep,
Like in the case
correct.
of financial institutions, there is also in the anti-money laundering space, there is also FIU, which is actually allowing you to file the things. So you also have something like that for insurance itself.
Yeah, the states, pretty much most states have regulations that state that if an insurance company suspects that insurance fraud is taking place, they must report that claim to the
Mm,
state institution that has jurisdiction for insurance fraud.
mm.
Most of the time, that's the state's Department of Insurance.
Okay. And so everything that enters into an investigation actually gets filed. Or is there a choice between? So, for example, every case that comes to SIU, is it filed to the state insurer?
No, we only will do that if we, after our investigation,
Mm,
suspect that there's fraud. Because again, there's individuals who, during the course of the claim, red flags pop up.
mm,
They suspect that's fraud. And then we'll investigate it. And it's not. It's a legitimate claim.
mm,
We're not going to report those to the state. That would be
mm.
wrong.
Yep, yep.
So we'll only report it to the state if we suspect, after our
Okay.
investigation, that fraud
So
has taken place.
after the 30 days, the timeline that you have, let's say, after a certain period of time that you have as a cutoff, let's say, irrespective of whether you pay or not pay, I mean, there's a scenario probably you have a suspicion, but you don't have enough proof to actually withhold the payment or take it further, right? So you have paid it off. So in that case, you still have a suspicion. So does this mean that in that scenario also, even if you after this SLA that you have paid off, would you still file?
Remember, we don't have to pay at 30 days. We
Mm,
usually do.
mm,
There's cases that we continually suspect and we're still in the process of investigating that might take more than 30 days. But again,
mm,
those are much more complex cases
mm,
that, for instance, we've sent it for depositions. So
mm,
those are the rare ones that we're talking
mm,
about. Um, if we suspect fraud still
mm,
a little bit and we've made some type of payment on the claim or whether we have made no payment on the claim,
mm,
uh, if we close our investigation, we will make that
mm.
report to the Department of Insurance.
Okay.
But once we pay the claim,
Mm,
usually that's the end of the investigation, usually,
mm. Okay. Okay.
because it's now become very hard to talk to the other side because why would
There,
they talk to you?
there's no motivation from their side to talk to you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So my final question is around, you've been in this space for a long time, right? And this is a question that I ask pretty much everyone that comes in as a guest to our show is what is your biggest frustration when it comes to, you're seeing things, you feel that things should be done, but for various reasons they don't happen, and things are not in your control essentially, right? So what is your biggest frustration around insurance fraud itself? What do you think should happen but has not happened?
I think the biggest frustration that myself or anyone who works in this space have is, it's what happens once you're concluded your investigation, you suspect that fraud has taken place or you have proof that fraud has taken place, and you filed it with, a state agency or some other type of law enforcement agency to move forward and they can criminally investigate. I think that there's not enough resources put into those law enforcement agencies. They work hard,
Yep.
but they're truly overwhelmed with just a huge amount of fraud that's taken place. You have state agencies, for instance, that might have 7 or 8 investigators for the entire state for that Department of Insurance, and they're
Mm,
getting hundreds of cases. That's hard.
yep.
So,
Mm,
I think the frustration on our end is, we find the fraud,
mm,
we report it,
mm,
and just because they don't have the manpower that maybe they could do something, for instance, to to
mm,
make it make
mm,
there be some type of consequence
mm,
for
mm,
that person committing the fraud. Because if
Mm,
the only consequence you have for potentially committing fraud is that your claim is denied,
mm,
well, whoop-de-doo. I
mm,
mean, if there's no criminal consequences,
mm,
you're going to have them say, all right, it's like a roulette game.
mm,
Let me keep trying, and eventually I'll
mm.
get some money from
Yep,
someone.
yep.
But I mean, just to give you an idea of how bad the fraud situation is, you
Mm,
know, I'll ask you, I'll switch it up for you. How much money do you think
mm,
the insurance industry loses more or less per year
mm,
to fraud in the United
mm.
States?
I would guess
How
around
much do
10
you think?
billion. 10 billion.
$308.6 billion dollars a year.
Oh,
That came
wow.
from a study last year from the University of Colorado.
Mm,
So that's a lot of money. That's a
mm.
lot of fraud.
Yep.
And if I just wish that those state organizations would get just a little more funding and a little more backup, and then maybe we could start changing the insurance fraud and situation.
Okay, understand. So you also talked about the fraud consortium, right? So when you suspect there's a fraud and also you conclude your investigation, I'm assuming you also file to that consortium itself. So that's actually kind of a consequence because as a fraudster, I probably find it challenging to get next insurance probably, right? So there's some sort of a
Sure.
consequence, but not probably not enough is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because in order to prevent crime,
Mm,
you
mm,
need to have two things: one, greater
mm,
detection;
mm,
two, consequences.
mm.
Either one helps prevent crime, but if you really want to prevent crime, you want to have both.
Yep, yep, yep. So one is detected fast and also have a serious consequence for that itself. Okay, that's a great quote to end our podcast with. Thank you so much, Anthony. I myself personally learned a lot about insurance itself, and I also have a newfound respect for the insurance industry. And I have been in touch with the insurance industry, but to be honest, I did not realize the depth of the problems that you would be probably be dealing with in your day-to-day base. So that's a learning for me. That's a great eye-opener for me itself. Thank you so much for that, and I would love to continue this dialogue and have you as a guest in the future itself. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Sure. I mean, if you want to go deep into into specific types of fraud, we
Yeah,
certainly could. It was a pleasure talking to you.
yeah. Thank you so much, Anthony. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too.